This is a reading from a collection of unpublished essays and papers and addresses by W.E.B. DuBois from 1887 to 1961, titled Against Racism, edited by Herbert Aptheker. The essay I'll be reading is called Colonialism, Democracy, and Peace After the War. It's written in the summer of 1944. At the invitation of the Haitian government and with the encouragement of the U.S. State Department, DuBois participated in several scholarly and cultural activities in Haiti during the summer of 1944. Two of his papers, given at this time, were published in French. Two other papers offered at that time, also prepared in French, are translated here. They anticipate in concentrated form DuBois's subsequent Color and Democracy, Colonies and Peace, published in 1945. The colonial groups in the post-war world. In the lectures which I am planning to deliver in Haiti, I want to examine with you the prospective status of the colonial groups in the world after the conclusion of this war and in the organization of peace for the future. You will, I am sure, bear with my imperfect French in this intricate and difficult task. First of all, I am deliberately using the word colonial in a much broader sense than is usually given it. A colony, strictly speaking, is a country which belongs to another country, forms a part of the mother country's industrial organization, and exercises such powers of government and such civic and cultural freedom as the dominant country allows. But beyond this narrower definition, there are manifestly groups of people, countries, and nations which, while not colonies in the strict sense of the word, yet so approach the colonial status as to merit the designation semi-colonial. The classic example of this status has long been China. There are other groups, like the Negroes of the United States, who do not form a separate nation, and yet who resemble in their economic and political condition a distinctly colonial status. For more on internal colonialism theory, read Robert Allen's Black Awakening in Capitalist America. It was a governor of the state of Georgia, Elias G. Arnall, who said in the recent Democratic nominating convention in Chicago, "We cannot continue as a nation to treat 13 millions of our citizens as semi-colonials." Then, too, there are a number of nations whose political independence is indisputed and who have a certain cultural unity, and yet by reason of their economic ties with the great industrial and capital exporting countries, find themselves severely limited in their freedom of action and opportunity for cultural development. They are, in a sense, the economic colonies of the owners of a closely knit world of global industry. The Balkan countries and those of South and Central America and the Caribbean area occupy in varying degrees this sort of economic semi-colonial status. Looking therefore upon this colonial and semi-colonial world, I wish first to ask what common characteristics we may discern, how these characteristics exhibit themselves in the different groups, and how these groups suffer common disabilities and hindrances with social classes in the more advanced lands of the world. And finally, what place these colonies should and will occupy in the democracy which we hope will gradually inherit the earth. There are in the first place certain characteristics of colonial peoples, which are so common and obvious that we seldom discuss them and often actually forget them. Colonial and quasi-colonial peoples are, as a mass, poverty-stricken, with the lowest standards of living. They are, for the most part, illiterate and unacquainted with the systematized knowledge of modern science, and they have little or no voice in their own government, with a consequent lack of freedom of development. All of these sound like Black people in America. Naturally, these characteristics vary widely among different groups and nations, so that before we generalize, make comparisons, and seek remedies, we must stop to examine certain specific types of colonial countries. This examination I shall make in very general terms in this lecture. Later, I hope to treat in more detail various selected lands. Let us first consider the colonies proper, the countries of America, Africa, and Asia, which we usually designate as colonies. In America, we have the British West Indies, the French islands, the American acquisitions. All of these conform to a well-known type. At the top, a group of varying size consisting mainly of whites and mulattoes. They are in income often well-to-do and sometimes rich. They are literate and in some cases highly cultured, and they have some voice in government. Below this group, and composing from 75 to 90%, are a mass of people, predominantly of direct African descent, illiterate largely, and making a decent living with difficulty, subject to disease and high infant mortality, and having for the most part no voice in government and with restricted personal freedom. Discussion of this situation in the past and largely today confines itself to the persisting disabilities of the elites, to questions of their political power and cultural recognition. There can be no question but that these matters are of grave concern and call for remedy. But our preoccupation with these problems, which in so many cases are peculiarly personal, must no longer blind us to the much vaster problem as to how far it is necessary that in the most beautiful part of the New World, the overwhelming mass of the inhabitants be precluded by poverty, ignorance, disease, and disenfranchisement from taking any effective part in modern civilization. White citizens of the United States and most Englishmen find nothing unusual or alarming in this situation. They have argued from the days of the slave trade that not more than a tenth of the Caribbean peoples are capable of modern civilization or conceivable participants in political and cultural democracy. Without any profound dissent, many of the colored folk themselves have accepted this dictum without question and confined their protest against social conditions to the situation of the elite, which certainly and justly demands betterment. This is interesting because, like DuBois is frequently known for his theory of the talented tenth, that 1/10 of Black people needed to be developed and would be the leaders of our race, which is a position he later in life left. But it's interesting here because it seems like that idea of the talented tenth is influenced actually by a European idea that only 1/10 of Africans in the Caribbeans were capable. So possibly Du Bois was trying to be like, okay, well, if this is the true situation, only 1/10, well, then that 1/10 is going to need to do it. Who knows if that's actually the true situation, but just speculating. But how has it been decided, and who has decided, that the social distribution of the Caribbean is normal and inevitable? We are led to question the conclusion all the more when we remember that it is not long since when the overwhelming proportion of the populations of most European countries was as poor and ignorant as modern colonial peoples. In answer to this reflection, the 19th century posed the question of race, of the existence of such inborn and ineradicable difference between stocks of human beings as made the proportion of civilizable people vastly different in Europe and America, and between the lighter and darker folk. I need not remind you how fierce a controversy arose over this theory of race, and how that pseudoscience long hindered not simply remedy for the degradation of colonials, but even conception of the possibility of remedy. Today, as we stand near halfway through a century which has proven the biological theories of unchangeable race differences manifestly false, what difference of action does this call for on our part? Another interjection. In Black Reconstruction, which I'm also reading on this channel, he talks about these pseudosciences, these race theories, were really assaults, especially after the 1880s, the Berlin Conference and Plessy vs. Ferguson, and the dismantling of Reconstruction. And what they did was they served as justification for the place that was assigned to the Negro, meaning at that time the relocation of slavery to convict leasing and a highly criminalizable people. Well, you people are lazy, evil, deserve to be in jail, which we will then still profit off of your labor. And we will generationally warehouse you there. And that plan has expanded since the 60s. First of all, it calls our attention to the fact that so far as science is concerned, there is no earthly reason why the elite of Haiti, Jamaica, Martinique, and Cuba should not comprise 9/10 instead of 1/10 of the population. If this be true, what hinders steps towards its realization? Such steps must begin with knowledge, with concerted effort, such as I am indicating in this lecture. To study colonial and quasi-colonial status in various parts of the world, turning to the colonies of Africa, we find certain differences and contrasts with the West Indies. In the colonies of West Africa and East Africa, the emerging group of the elite as a recognizable class is largely missing. There are outstanding personalities and social movements, but instead of conforming to the European class pattern, they link themselves to another and a different social heritage. The tradition of a strong and ancient organization persists. An organization that linked the mass of the people directly to the chief through an intricate nobility. In this society, the tribe became an integral sense in which the interests of no individual were neglected. There has recently been published a most thorough-going study of the kingdom of Nupe in Nigeria. Any person, white or black, who has a lingering conception that Africa evolved no political state should read this book. But in this case, as in most African colonies, there has cut across this ancient pattern, changing, spoiling, and even partially obliterating it, the modern colonial system, born in the West Indies and transferred to the source of the developed slave trade. This system substitutes for the local, home-born, and home-developed elite foreign control, represented by a mere handful of more or less temporary representatives who govern the tribe or state. The objects of this government determine the character of the colony. The earlier African colonies were for purposes of trade, and all government was directed toward facilitating trade. Outside that, the colony conducted its own affairs in its own way. Then, certain valuable articles of trade came into greater demand, and pressure was brought to bear to increase the supply. Slave trade and slavery resulted overseas, but on the African mainland, gold, vegetable oils, copper, and diamonds became more valuable than slaves in the West Indies, and the tribal organization was partially or wholly disrupted to supply regular labor. The value of these new products undermined the foundation of slavery in the New World. Slavery, therefore, disappeared from the New World, especially when Toussaint and others used force to accelerate this development. On the other hand, Toussaint Louverture of Haiti, obviously, the African colony became, therefore, a vast business organization to reap profit for European investors out of the invested capital and forced labor of Africa. Across this cut the efforts of missionaries and philanthropists and West Indian and American free Negroes. The result today is a series of African colonies conducted for profit, and yet with their policy modified so as to recognize in varying degree the development and progress of the native. With all the advance made, it is fair to say that the investment motive is still supreme in West and East Africa. It is less powerful in French Senegal, but in the Belgian Congo, while changed materially from the disgraces of Leopold, it is still an investment far more than a philanthropy. In South Africa, strong tribal organization met modern industrial exploitation and finance capital head-on. The result is the most complicated race problem on Earth, with retrogression and reaction fighting against almost every forward movement of the native proletariat and opposed by a small but growing philanthropy on the part of the whites. So like two modern examples then of like resources in Africa. So one, you could obviously say like coltan and tungsten in Congo, which are mined for our electronics, for jet engines, for all kinds of tech. These are like semiconductors. And those are like right now in Congo, the Rwandan group M23 is over there, and allegedly Trump is negotiating peace deals between Tshisekedi and Kagame, and these peace deals result in mineral deals, mineral transfers. And now there's going to be like the establishment of like a UAE funded paramilitary for the minerals to make sure that the production schedule is on track. So there's coltan, and obviously like UAE is just like billionaires. So the Israeli and the USA front. And the UAE then is also funding the genocide in Sudan, which is to extract gold. And then another precious metal example is diamonds in Botswana. They've got, I think, more diamonds than any other place in Africa, and yet they are nailed into a contract with De Beers so that they can only sell their diamonds to De Beers. So functionally, De Beers is the owner of the mineral rights of Botswana. Turning now to Asia, we face the problem of India, the largest colony in the world and the one that poses the greatest colonial problem. In India, we have an ancient culture, an intricate political history, and a long economic development. On this fell the power of the West and East. The East with organized military power, the West first with the religious might of organized Mohammedism, meeting the spiritual seeds of indigenous Buddhism. On this was thrown in the century before the widest growth of the African slave trade, the newly organized power of the new capitalism, which American slavery had given birth to in England. The loot of India by European political adventurers and merchants established modern capitalism in Europe, and with the accompanying technical and scientific inventions, gave Europe mastery of the world. Capitalism was a great and beneficent method of satisfying human wants, without which the world would have lingered on the edge of starvation. But, like all invention, the results depended upon how it is used and for whose benefit. Capitalism had benefited mankind, but not in equal proportions. It has enormously raised the standard of living in Europe and even more in North America. But in the parts of the world where human toil and natural resources have made the greatest contribution to the accumulation of wealth, such parts of the earth, curiously enough, have benefited least from the new commerce and industry. This is shown by the plight of Africa and India today. To be sure, Africans and Indians have benefited by modern capital. In education, limited though it may be, in curbing of disease, slow and incomplete as it is, in the beginning of the use of machines and labor technique, and in the spread of law and order, both Negroes and Hindus have greatly benefited, but as compared with what might have been done, and what injustice and right should have been accomplished, the result is not only pitiful, but so wrong and dangerous as already to have helped cause two of the most destructive wars in human history, and is today threatening further human death and disaster. To realize this, look at India today. Again, it's like 1944. No one has ever tried to prove that its vast horde of 350 million people are not normal human beings and as gifted as the Europeans. No one denies that Indians have worked hard and long and have been cunning in technique, profound in thought and lofty in religious ideal. Yet this land, after 300 years' subjection to European political control and industrial domination, is poverty-stricken to an inconceivable degree, is 90% illiterate, is diseased and famine-cursed, and has limited voice in its own government. It is, for instance, in this war not by its own consent, but by declaration of Great Britain. Thousands of its leaders who have dared peacefully to protest against this situation are today in jail. Dutch and French India approach, with some modifications and variations, the British Indian pattern. In other words, India, while a partner in the development of modern capitalistic civilization, and while sharing some of its benefits, has received so small and inadequate a share as compared with Europe that its present plight is a disgrace to the world. And this is because the modern world, under the guidance of Europe and North America, has become used to thinking that the plight of the human millions of Asia and Africa is normal, essentially right and unchangeable, except after long periods of evolution, if even then. Let us now turn to certain states which are not colonies, but which for various reasons approximate the colonial status. Some of these are China, many of the countries of South America, and groups like the Negroes in the United States and the Indians of the Americas. To these may be added the majority of the Balkan states, the states of the Near East, and the independent Negro countries, Liberia, Haiti, and Ethiopia. In these cases, there was recognized political independence and a cultural heritage of varying strength and persistence. But on the other hand, in all these cases, the economic dependence of the country on European and North American industrial organization in commerce and sale of raw materials, and especially in obtaining the use of capital in the shape of machinery and manufactured material, this dependence on world industry makes the country largely dependent on financial interests and cultural ideals quite outside the land itself. A side note, Walter Rodney and How Europe Underdeveloped Africa also says that this relationship of dependence through unequal trade relations is actually one of the main goals of the global imperial economic system. And then, Fanon says that, preceding colonialism was trade, military, and civil takeover. So trade is actually really key relationship insofar as what establishes a colony, what perpetuates it, even as DuBois says that most of these colonies that were operated by Europe were operated for purposes of trade. That means these are satellites that these whole societies are geared towards like a kind of integration with, like he said, the mother country's industrial desires, its profit margins. But then going back to the example of India, it doesn't see back these gains. The gains are unequally exchanged with Europe and North America. There have been many cases where this partnership between a land of labor and material and a land of wealth, technical efficiency, and accumulated capital goods has worked advantageously for both. But in most modern instances, the wealthy country is thinking in terms of profit and is obsessed with the long ingrained conviction that the needs of the weaker country are few and its capacity for development narrow or non-existent. In that case, this economic partnership works to the distinct disadvantage of the weaker country. The terms of sale for raw materials, the price of goods and rent of capital, even the wages of labor are dictated by the stronger partner, backed by economic pressure and military power. And so metaphorically, this is like saying that like your country is a perpetual child, always dictated by the adult. You're a minority. You're a minority, right? You cannot assume the power of a non-minority being or state. The case of China is, and like a minority is a child, right? It's like even in the Bible, and it's like, oh, when I was a child, I thought as a child. So the idea is that the darker world is a perpetual child to the white world. The case of China is well known. The seat of the oldest civilization surviving in the world. China was compelled at gunpoint to trade with Europe. And then they filled them with opium for that 100 years of humiliation. This procedure was justified as leading to the Christianization and economic uplift of this great land. The results justify this method only in part. For the most part, the colonial pattern prevailed, a mass of poverty-stricken people, illiterate and diseased, with their political autonomy partially nullified, until when native resentment revolted in the late 19th century. Europe planned to divide the country into colonies. This was delayed by the rise of Japan as a major power and her insistence on sharing the spoils. From this point, the path to world war was straight and clear. The Indian and Negro group in America have paused on a threshold, leading by one door to complete integration with the countries where they reside, and by another door leading to the organization of a sort of nation within a nation, which approaches colonial status on the one hand and eventual incorporation on the other. The Indians have taken one path, and the Negroes of the United States the other. The eventual result is not clear and depends to a degree on the development of the colonial status among other peoples of the world. In the case of the Balkans and the Near East, a strong cultural tradition urges them toward independent nationhood, while the elite of their own people, especially the great landlords, the new manufacturers and home capitalists, stand in such close alliance with and dependent on the European industrial and financial organization that most of these countries remain bound hand and foot by a web of their own weaving. This is peculiarly true of Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. In South America, the pattern changes because the cultural heritage and bond is weaker, and the social conditions in Europe become guide and ideal for the independent American colony. The normal situation, with poverty, ignorance, disease, and disenfranchisement, seems in the eternal nature of things, and nearly all effective effort is expended on raising an elite which shall be recognized by Europe and share the privileges of Europeans. Only in comparably recent days has an ideal arisen in lands like Chile, Peru, and Brazil of a spiritually independent South America, with a people of white, red, and black blood intermingled, and with a laboring class as high in standards of living and political rights as the best of European lands. The independent Negro nations, Haiti, Liberia, and Ethiopia, suffer first from the widespread assumption of the 19th century that African and the black race were not an integral part of the human picture, and consequently could not and must not be allowed to try to develop like other nations along the lines of economic uplift, social development, and political independence. We Negroes who in the last half-century have convinced ourselves of our equality with mankind and our ability to share modern culture scarcely realize how high a wall of prejudice based on color we have still to surmount today. This makes us all the more eager to force recognition of our worth, and too often forgetful of how the burden rests on us as on all peoples, to increase and increase rapidly and widely among the masses of people within our group who are still depressed in poverty, ignorance, and disease, and incapable of adding to the total of the emerged classes, the ability, physical strength, and spiritual wealth of which they are possessed. The studied and bitter attack on Liberia because of alleged slave raiding was of minor importance so far as the facts were concerned. Britain, France, Spain, Belgium, and other countries had been pursuing, and still were pursuing in some cases in Africa, identical methods of labor recruitment as Liberia. But beyond the bare facts was the allegation that Liberia was using against her own people the methods which she protested when used by whites. Even this was not really true, but it had enough semblance of truth to hurt Liberia deeply. The same tactics used against Ethiopia almost fixed the charge of slavery upon this land at the very time she was making hard effort to abolish the slave status. I need not remind you how often and persistently the charge of voodooism brought against you has so twisted the clear truth as to emphasize the denial of cultural equality to a land which has in so many instances led America in cultural development. Yet here the truth is that your cultural elite, with all its fine accomplishment, is not anywhere near as large as wealth, education, and health might raise up from your peasantry. Now, let me sum up this preliminary survey of the colonial problem. The depressed peoples and classes of the world form the vast majority of mankind today in the era of the highest civilization the world has known. The majority of human beings do not today have enough to eat and wear or sufficient shelter for decent existence. The majority of the world's peoples do not understand what the world is, what it has been, and what the laws of its growth and development are, and they are unable to read the record of this history. Most human beings suffer and die years before this is necessary, and most babies die before they ever really live. And the human mind, with all its visions and possibilities, is today deliberately distorted and denied freedom of development by people who actually imagine that such freedom would endanger civilization. Actually, yeah, to speak to the attack on the mind, Dr. Jared Ball, I Mix What I Like on YouTube, had a conversation last year with Owasami Burton, and they were talking about this article that came out from an American military journal, and they were talking about cognitive warfare. In this essay, which is like peer-reviewed military science type stuff, they're saying that, and came out again last year. They're saying that the U.S. Needs to adapt more diverse methods of warfare than purely kinesthetic, because countries like China deploy not just kinesthetic but psychological, economic, and even sometimes like chemical warfare on their enemies. And these are things that the U.S. does too. But the article was advocating that nowadays the most vulnerable part of a nation is its human capital. And that starts with the cognitive abilities. So the people need to develop offensive and defensive cognitive capabilities to protect themselves against the cognitive warfare. That they themselves, the U.S., wants to develop offensive techniques and defensive techniques. And so, yeah, that's a perfect example of modernly the human mind with all its visions and possibilities today being deliberately distorted, because they themselves define cognitive warfare as anything designed to degrade the ability to know. What now can be done about this in this day of crisis, when, with the end of a horrible and disgraceful war in sight, we contemplate peace and democracy? What has peace to do with colonies, and what has skin color to do with peace?